Good morning. So I would like to argue today the following: that Uganda's preparations for oil, especially the institutional investments and legislative arrangements, are insufficient by themselves to prevent the traditional risks posed by oil production, and that the reason for this is that it won't be the quality or even the content of this institutional and legal environment that will define the oil sector. Instead, this sector will be shaped by the character of Ugandan politics. I would also like to put forward that, therefore, alongside these legal and institutional reforms, Uganda must, within the next 10 years, attempt to come together to reconstruct the political system itself in order to guarantee that the commercial success we wish for the oil happens, but also to insulate our Ugandan society from the havoc that oil normally causes. Finally, I am suggesting that the mechanism for reform of the political system is a constituent assembly, because it is my belief that the current constitution and its system of checks and balances no longer functions normally, and therefore that a constituent assembly is a more inclusive process as opposed to, for example, the kinds of changes that can emanate from an elected government under the present conditions. But before I start, allow me to welcome our online audience, but also extend my support for this talk to the organizers, the Open Society Institute for Eastern Africa and its sister organizations, and my special thanks to the Open Society Foundation and the fellowship team in New York for a wonderful year as an Open Society Fellow. This talk is titled Why Uganda Needs a Constitutional Crisis: The Legal and Institutional Limitations of Uganda's Journey as one of Africa's latest oil producers. And the hashtag is Uganda 2022. It really reflects what is at the heart of the matter. By 2022, Uganda would have started producing oil from the Albertine Valley. And by my own calculations, Ugandans in 2022 are likely to have a new president. Thus, in the decade, we shall be witnesses to a double transition, one which is political and the other one economic. This double transition is approaching quickly. All of you are witnesses even now to the pressures on public institutions that are coming from both politics and the needs to change our economy. So the question is, shall we be ready? I don't think today that we are ready, but I believe that that's a possibility. It's a possibility also that we shall have the first peaceful political transition in Uganda's history. And I also believe that in the period of the next 10 years, it's very possible that Uganda will start exporting its oil in circumstances that benefit the majority and not just a precious few. Oil was first discovered, as you all know, in 2005. That was an important year because major political changes happened then. They included the move to multi-party politics and controversial constitutional amendments that resulted in the lifting of presidential term limits. I might also add that those amendments included the decision to make oil a preserve of the state. Since then, estimates of Uganda's oil is in the excess of about 10 billion barrels pending further exploration. So oil and politics is tied from the beginning and will be tied in the future. Today, when we talk about the oil generation, we are talking about 15-year-olds and 25-year-olds that reflect the average age of Ugandans. In 10 years, when commercial oil starts reaping benefits, this category of people will be in their 30s and their 40s. So it will be that decade after 2022 that will really be the decade for the oil generation. This is the generation for whom economic changes brought about by the oil mean the most. And they face, I think as we do today, the choice either to reform or to revolt. Alongside the preparations for oil production, we are simultaneously confronting another problem today, that is of a peaceful political transition. Uganda has never had a peaceful handover of power from one ruler to another, or even from one government to another, save for when the Union Jack was lowered in 1962 to raise the national flag at the time. Since that time, violent political competition and eventually civil war have determined who governs this country, with disastrous consequences for Ugandan society, its economy, and its citizens. The violence of the first half of independence meant that public institutions, commercial ventures, and peaceful political competition never took root. And wars also saw a lost generation, that independence generation, many of whom had their professional lives disrupted. And in fact, I think that there was a war on intellectuals at the time. Most of the brilliant minds had to flee the country to exile, stage a fight, or simply die in Uganda's killing fields. So lack of political stability has been a traditional problem for not just Uganda, but for its economy, and particularly for its petroleum prospects. You know, the British colonial authorities postponed plans to commercialize oil several times from the 1900s, both due to war and poor economic conditions, including, by the way, the situation created by the 1945 World Wars, and thereafter the changing political landscape in emerging independent Africa. Uganda's first petroleum legislation was passed in 1957, just a few years shy of official independence, but violent political conflict after independence acted as a permanent filibuster for petroleum exploration. So oil exploration work continued to suffer after the 1981 to 1986 war, especially in areas in the north, just above Lake Albert, where the LRA had managed to create unstable conditions until the Christmas of 2005. In fact, Murchison Falls National Park and areas that present the most promising prospects for oil are in those very same areas for conflict. But I think perhaps the most vivid example of human suffering that epitomizes this problem of the history of violence in Uganda and the history of violence in oil areas today is what happened in, if you'd like, the upper Luo and the lower Luo areas. Twice, both during the colonial experiment and later in post-independence Uganda, this community is known as the Luo Babito, or the contemporary societies of the Banyoro in the south of the Albertine and their Luo cousins in the north faced virtual extermination. In the late 1800s, as you know, Bunyoro witnessed a terrible war of attrition waged by the colonial authorities on the proud kingdom of Chwa Kabalega that decimated Bunyoro. Thereafter, starting in 1987, a war of containment was fought in northern Uganda, waged with the same ferocity, a scorched earth policy, lasting 20 years, which brought the Luo cousins of the Banyoro to their knees. Untold human suffering in horrible camp conditions, in both cases, crushed an entire society through disease, torture, and degrading treatment. Perhaps one of the supreme ironies, actually, of Uganda's oil story is that it was later a British oil company founded by former soldiers that discovered oil. That company is called Heritage Oil and Gas and was led by Anthony Buckingham, an ex-soldier in Her Majesty's government, who made his fortune as head of a military consulting company, or if you prefer, he was simply a modern-day mercenary. So as we can see, political stability and the longevity of viable constitutional order are critical, not just for oil exploration and commercialization, but more so in situations where no constitution has fully survived the change of government. Nearly every government that took power in Uganda created its own constitution or legal arrangements that overrode the pre-existing constitution. This is the case in 1967 and the rule by military decree after the Idi Amin coup in 1971. Uganda's experience actually is not unique. It's a very African experience. Post-independence African governments that were successful in producing oil have done so in conditions of violent political competition, operating through weak and unstable institutions. This crop of pioneer oil producers, including economic giants like Nigeria and smaller nations like Equatorial Guinea, have come to symbolize what today we call the curse of plenty, or the oil curse. Perhaps the worst example of all is the story of the Democratic Republic of Congo, whose weak national institutions and history of political conflict have stunted what is undoubtedly one of Africa's most naturally endowed countries. In 1990, the government of Mobutu signed a joint exploration and production agreement with Uganda. This unitization agreement still stands as one of the most progressive agreements in Uganda's own oil story. It covers common ownership and production of oil in the Albert and Graben. However, the process of exploration on the Congolese side of the border has lagged behind Uganda's, and our most recent success story there, part due to continual insecurity and political challenges in the DRC. So to answer the questions of our collective future, we must ask ourselves hard questions with no easy answers. We must debate this openly and decide which political and public institutions will be capable of being the responsible midwife of the coming years. Our current political institutions capable of overseeing historical peaceful transfer of power by 2022? Will these institutions facilitate the prudent management of oil revenues? The answers to this basically will define our collective responsibility and our commitment to our shared future. For the oil and gas sector, these questions are very important. They're important to commercial success. Uganda's oil discoveries are unique and present new challenges. In fact, some of these challenges are found nowhere else in the world. There are challenges of both geography and institutional location. Uganda's geography is that the oil is located right in the heart of the Great Lakes region with its history of violence, and the oil fields themselves are located in sensitive environment areas. Uganda is also a landlocked country, so commercializing its oil involves exporting to both regional and international markets. It is no easy task. It requires stability domestically and regionally. But Uganda also intends to lead commercialization with heavy investments in a local refinery. The feasibility of this policy requires stable political and public institutions at home and viable regional markets, especially within the East African community. Now, oil, as I said, is located in the volatile western border, where violent conflict continues within the DRC, and large stateless areas the size of Uganda itself present very practical and real security challenges. Maybe the most unique thing about Uganda's oil, including the new prospective areas, is that they are located in national parks, protected wetlands, and around water bodies like the transboundary lake Albert, which is shared between Uganda and DRC. The extraction of oil therefore risks environmental damage, but environmental damage is not the only concern for Uganda is a concern for all the riparian states because Lake Albert flows through the Albert Nile into River Nile. So livelihoods as like fishing depend on the environmental sustainability of oil extraction. In a worst case scenario, the contamination of Lake Albert or protected areas may trigger local and regional conflict and precipitate the flight of international oil companies whose profitability in today's world depends on their reputation as responsible corporate citizens. So oil production in Uganda faces unique challenges of security in one of the most volatile regions in the world and of environmental protection in one of the most endowed areas in the world. These challenges must be addressed by strong domestic institutions. So the question is, when you look around, do these institutions exist today? Now, a look at the oil sector landscape shows serious problems. One in particular stands out. Most Ugandan institutions constructed on what is known as international best practice. Now, that's a dilemma I want to address today. Now, optimists about Uganda and Africa's oil sector, including me, consider that the difference between Nigeria and Uganda or between Angola and Ghana is one between hindsight and foresight. New oil and gas producers can look back at the mistakes old ones made and avoid them, or so the argument goes. Subsequently, across Africa, countries like Uganda and Ghana are embracing this so-called international best practice to benchmark our new oil and gas sectors. Employing international best practice, of course, is the wrong approach. It is often presented as an answer to current problems and future problems, which it is not. Uganda has followed best practice in many areas. In oil and gas sector, for example, we have new legislation, the oil and gas policy of 2008, as well as many other policies that are presented as kosher because they're an amalgamation of the best practices around the world. Best practice describes how things are supposed to work under laboratory conditions. This is not how things work in reality. Ultimately, the state of Uganda's institutions, our unique history, our political culture, and our environment here hold sway over how carefully calibrated policies are gleaned as they are from mistakes elsewhere, or if we can even avoid them. In other words, the primary responsibility for institutional building is to look at our own resources, our own history, and our own capacity, not simply our ambitions. Consider first some of these domestic institutions charged with protecting the environment. The National Environmental Management Authority is charged with regulating the activities that affect the environment, but NEMA, like most other domestic institutions, struggles with funding and retaining professional staff. Thus, much of the professional and environmental expertise today is concentrated in the international oil companies. I see some friends here from the NGO sector, and I must sadly inform you that there is hardly any professional expertise of any bearing that exists in the non-state sector. So dire is this human capital deficit in the state sector that recently, when the Chinese National Oil Company applied for a permit to do drilling under Lake Albert, because NEMA did not have the capacity or the funding, it asked the Chinese company to do the tests and then approved the tests that were done by the company it was supposed to regulate. So NEMA's director is my friend, Dr. Tom Okurut, gave permission for drilling to proceed on tests that were conducted on non-indigenous fish species in a Chinese laboratory. There are many examples of this variety I can recount from the time that I spent studying this sector. Take, for example, Uganda's premier oil institution, the Petroleum Exploration and Production Department. That too is struggling to keep pace with the sector. In fact, PEPD who most of us work with, and it's an interesting story. In the 90s, when it was hunting for oil, it was largely ignored because no Ugandan institution thought that there was oil. So they left the professionals alone. When oil was discovered, they have now been stampeded by politicians and other institutions. Anytime you hear people talk about PEPD as a professional organization, it's because it was sequestered for many years. Geologists were running it, largely ignored and insulated from the ravages of politics outside Entebbe. Now, the best practice dilemma perhaps can be illustrated by an old parable I'll read from you from the book of Matthew. I'm not going to preach to you, so don't be afraid. You've heard this parable before. I'll read. Once there was a man who went out to sow corn. He scattered the seed in the field. Some of it fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some of it fell on rocky ground where there was little soil. The seeds soon sprouted because the soil wasn't deep. But when the sun came up, it burnt the young plants, and because the roots had not grown deep enough, the plants soon dried up. Some of the seeds fell amongst bushes, which grew up and choked the plants. But some of it fell on good soil, and the plants produced corn. Some produced 100 grains, others 60, and others 30. And of course, Jesus, who concluded this parable, said, "Listen, those who have ears." I'm not going to write a book called The Parable of the Sower, so don't kill me for it. Institutions, especially best practice institutions, are like perfectly good corn seed. However, their performance is dependent on the conditions that they find. If the conditions are poor, they die. In less than ideal conditions, they may survive, but they will not thrive. It is truly good conditions that make institutions thrive. Now, Ugandans from all walks of life often say that this country has good policies, that is the implementation that is the problem. But that's their way of saying that laws and policies may be good, but the conditions that they confront is what fails them. Like the sower, can we reasonably expect that institutions of today will thrive tomorrow? If not, what shall we do about it? This is partly the problem of sector-by-sector analysis that goes hand in hand with appraisals of international best practice. The problem of present-day reforms, including the two petroleum laws, the proposed revenue management law, and the institutions that will emerge, is that they do not and will not define the oil and gas sector. It is the political environment that does. The Ugandan public sector today is ravaged by institutional inertia. A good place to start is to look at the massive delays on important national projects such as the National ID project or even the construction of the Karuma Dam, Uganda's latest high-power, largest hydroelectric power project. Procurement delays, largely driven by graft and corruption, now average 10 years, and often they raise the cost of projects by more than half. Uganda's stellar procurement regime, which is actually calibrated based on best practice, notwithstanding. The capital-intensive energy and road sectors are impaled by this problem. But this is not about the institutional setup per se, because corruption in Uganda is a political industry. Recent government reports suggest that over half the annual budget is stolen. According to the African peer review mechanism, some 550 billion Ugandan shillings leaks out of this system every year. That's about $3 billion in the next 10 years. Basically enough money to build our refinery. So corruption does not only lead, by the way, to tremendous leakages of cash, it saps the energy of the professional classes, many of whom are fleeing Uganda whenever possible. Public sector corruption also leads to poor allocations of resources and talent, or what I would like to call the decline of the merit society that fails to survive in the public sector. It is not possible to reform such a system through laws and policies alone. We must reform, therefore, the political system itself, including our system of checks and balances. An overhaul of this system will take time, it will take debate. The ballooning size of the government, the profligate corruption that we see, has occurred largely to the benefit of those we entrust to lead this country. It doesn't really benefit the majority of Ugandans. But it's also it's a product of a political system that relies not on the strength of good policy, but on the robustness of political patronage. And so we are headed in a place which is not so nice. Preparing ourselves to resolve this will involve addressing 4 key issues, which I'll go through. But all these 3 or 4 issues require constitutional review. One is we must reduce the size of the government. 2, we must strengthen our system of checks and balances. 3, we must create incentives for a peaceful transfer of power. And 4, we must transfer and complete real civilian control of the military. There is near universal agreement in Uganda that the size of the government is driven basically by the requirements of political patronage, and that it is too big, and that the growth of official bureaucracy is not a growth of competence. But how can one resize the government today, reduce the number of MPs without a constitutional overhaul? Another defining feature of the Ugandan political system is not just its size, but it's the expensive and domineering executive. The impact of a dominant executive is the near complete erosion of our system of checks and balances between the different arms of government. My colleagues here, a law professor, 2 law professors, and Morrison, who sits with the presidency, understands exactly what this means. I don't want to go through the case of Mr. Benjamin Odoki, Chief Justice, but one can see the shocks of a domineering executive on an institution such as the judiciary. So how can you provide for a less powerful executive without constitutional review? Maybe an example to look at is that of the story in Chile. Chile also was run by a military strong government, but the transition from Augusto Pinochet actually was done through transitional arrangements that were grounded in the constitution, namely that they allowed Pinochet to retire. They provided for immunity after office, and then they made him, I think, senator for life afterwards. And that allowed Chile to go through a process of fairly peaceful political transition. I have talked about this idea with people who think that it is not very serious, but alongside the constitutional reforms that are possible within this 10 years, which is unique to Uganda's history. Like I said, we don't know how to do a peaceful political transition. Not this government, because it's never happened before in our history, would be to provide for permanent immunity for the current holder of office, and create incentives for a political transition that takes into account the unique political history and that acknowledges the contributions of a president while in office without seeking to punish him afterwards. Perhaps last and not least, on this list of transitional challenges is the place of the Ugandan military establishment in our society and our politics. After 1986 and the victory of the national resistance movement, it transformed itself into the Ugandan army, but its leaders became politicians and have continued to lead the government by engaging in electoral politics. But this has led to present-day accusations of institutional bias by the armed services. Part of this bias, of course, is debated quite openly, that the armed services is represented in parliament and have an overbearing impact on civilian public life. How can Uganda provide for an independent military without reforming this constitution? So in this next decade, Ugandans have an opportunity to reform the political system, and in so doing, provide room for institutions to allow the people and the economy to flourish. It is the safe political transition that will determine the operating environment for the institutions of the future. It is a stable economic transition that will allow us to support our growing population. And so by 2022, we will actually know, the jury will be out if we have succeeded. My own proposal is for this goal to be achieved, we must seriously consider a new Constituent Assembly to reform the Constitution and reorganize our system of government. And I propose this largely because the Constituent Assembly provides the best chance for inclusive reform. The other option is to allow for elections to produce a government, and then that government can reform. But as we have seen, I think this government is trapped in its size, and I do not see that in a contested electoral process that the kind of changes that I'm proposing here, which are necessary, can be achieved. For the oil and gas sector, this is really the environment that you want to look to. I would like to end by congratulating my colleagues at the Ministry of Energy and the Petroleum Department, and mainly for their efforts to maintain a professional approach to the sector, and many Ugandan professionals that have joined them, and other government departments that have supported them, and to the non-state sector that had attempted to keep them honest. I thank you very much, and I turn this over to you.